The new My Hero Academia chapter has hinted at many interesting things. We talk about the reason why All For One cried when he fought the second user of One For All and how that moment might have something to do with why he was afraid of Bakugo when he reminded him of the second user. Also, it looks like one of our predictions came true that the second user's quirk could be dangerous for the whole world. Furthermore, we talk about the last resort that All For One revealed at the end of the chapter. What is the meaning of the 9 lights? Could it have something to do with the 9 vestiges of One For All? Or are these 9 lights connected to 9 villains? Does All For One have 9 seeds? Could Spinner be one of them, since he was shown at the end of the chapter? And is it possible that Toya is the second one, because he is confirmed to be a seed for All For One? Is that the light we saw on his chest? There are so many things we need to discuss. If you end up liking this review, consider subscribing. Please enjoy this video. Let's go! The new My Hero Academia chapter 369 begins with a very interesting flashback of All For One holding and choking the second user of One For All many years ago. What's really fascinating though is that All For One looks like he's actually crying. When you think about All For One and his personality, and generally his whole character, it's really hard to imagine him being able to cry at all for whatever reason. And yet here we see it in black and white, tears rolling down his face. Such an absurd image must have an important and deep meaning. Here of course we must remember that this scene is from the first generation of quirk users. That is, it took place a few hundred years ago. Of course people change over such a long period of time, and All For One has certainly gone through a lot. So one could assume that he might have changed over the years. It's possible that he was still relatively human back then, so to speak. That could get a bit interesting considering his entire existence is currently being rewound. Let's keep that in mind. Maybe we'll see how All For One's personality changes. But still, it's hard to imagine that his core intention has changed completely, because Yoichi, the first user of One For All, and All For One's brother, has been trying to stop All For One since the first day the One For All quirk was born. And even before that, he refused to support All For One's tyranny. So evilness has always been All For One's dark passenger. But considering that All For One nevertheless cried back then, when his goal and ambition were practically as fresh as a newborn baby, we can assume that his ultimate goal might actually be much more profound than what we would expect from an emotionless All For One today. Nowadays, there's absolutely nothing left of an emotional All For One we saw a few hundred years ago. At least he doesn't show it. All human traits are gone. He's cold with no real deep emotions. Not even when he's defeated does he show anger or sadness. In fact, he always seems to be happy, even if there's no reason to be happy. And yet he's most likely pursuing the same goal as before. That his intentions have not changed much is evident from the fact that he still mentions the comic books he read in his youth as the reason for being evil. He explains that he understands the villain's intentions and finds it illogical that the villains are always much stronger, but for some reason always lose to the heroes. The system they live in is itself corrupt and evil, which the villains try to change, but the heroes of such stories try to prevent just that. All this makes little sense for All For One, and so he plans a realistic ending for his own story, a story in which he is the villain and will be victorious. In doing so, he has not only admitted that he himself is a villain, so he knows what he is doing, and that he understands the concept of right and wrong, at least when it comes to our social construct. But he also proves that his intentions have been more or less the same over the years from the first moment he decided to become a villain. We know that All For One plans to conquer the whole world, make everyone equally poor and exploit everything that is available so that he becomes the sole and only provider of all possible vital resources. In doing so, he will not only enslave everyone but also create equality, thus ending all conflicts. No more wars, no more problems. He believes this is the closest thing to what the heroes consider peace. He will thus become the ultimate demon lord and king of the world. Listening to this plan, it's really not something that could make someone like All For One cry, not even hundreds of years ago. But here it is also important to know that he has also indicated that this is only the first stage of his plan, or rather not the entire plan. What I just explained was part of Aoyama's knowledge that he received from his parents, who in turn heard this from All For One, who promised them a good position in this world government. Obviously, someone like All For One would never have revealed the full true plan to people like Aoyama's parents. Why should he? He would only tell them what they want to hear, which is that he promises them a good life under his world regime, while also revealing only the most necessary details for them to basically become his puppets. So there's clearly more to it, as he himself confirmed when he said that Aoyama's explanation was not quite right. So either his parents weren't listening properly, which I highly doubt, or All All For One just didn't reveal the whole truth, which is likely the case. So his final goal could indeed be something that would make normal people cry if they pursued it, especially at the beginning of their plan when all emotions are still fresh, as was the case with All For One back then. Perhaps the ultimate plan of All For One is not so cold-hearted but has a deeper meaning for him personally, which would explain why he wants to seize world domination. Usually villains always have a reason or a tragic past that explains their intentions, but so far we haven't heard anything like that from All For One, something that tempted them to become evil, and maybe at that moment All For One felt emotionally connected to that reason and started crying because of it, simply because those emotions and that possible reason were still fresh at that time. Today, hundreds of years later, All For One is simply emotionless, or has simply lost the emotional connection to this reason over the years. This of course is only the case considering the fact that these tears come from sadness. Of course, there could be a lot of other reasons and also different emotions that could cause such tears. For example, he could be crying because he just killed his own brother and now he's holding the second use of One For All. This could be the moment when All For One might have understood what the One For All quirk actually is. It is likely that he might have tried to steal the quirk of the second user but failed because it became part of One For All. And when he then tried to steal One For All, he failed because this quirk can only be transferred with the will of the current user. All For One could have understood this and saw his own little brother in the second user of One For All and cried because of the loss of his own brother, who now lives on in One For All and will forever try to stop him and his ultimate goal. We know that All For One really loves his brother. In fact, Yoichi was the only person that All For One really loved and cared about in his own sick way, and still loves even today. He really wanted Yoichi to be part of his plan and basically rule by his side. And because Yoichi refused and even rebelled against All For One, he decided not to kill him like he did with any other person who dared to stand in his way, but to imprison him and convince him until Yoichi would voluntarily support All For One. He even gave him a quirk, hoping that it would help him understand what he was trying to accomplish so that maybe Yoichi would start supporting his older brother. But instead, the second user saved Yoichi and so the One For All quirk was born. That could very well be the reason why All For One cried. He really loves his brother and he feels betrayed. If All For One hadn't given Yoichi this quirk because he loves his little brother so much, none of this would have happened and All For One would have achieved his goal long ago. But as I said, there are many other emotions that can make a person cry, such as happiness, relief, stress, exhaustion, anger, physical pain, emotional pain, disappointment, sadness, empathy, and different reasons. This can be due to a loss, a broken heart, betrayal, and many other things. But people cry not only because of emotions but also for other reasons. For example, tears that cover the eyes because they help to supply fluid. We know that Erasure Head keeps his eyes wet because it prevents him from blinking. There are many such reasons, for example to clean the eyes, to improve eyesight. Look at Bakugo, he was crying but we don't really know if it was because of sadness or because he awakened a new power that sharpened his vision, causing his eyes to basically cry. So maybe it had something to do with a quirk. And even tears caused by pain in the eyes themselves are possible. Think of peeling onions, for example. I think you get the idea. The variety of reasons why All For One was crying is enormous. But one thing is for sure, Horikoshi has definitely created a little mystery with this aspect. But enough about the crybaby All For One, let's move on to the new My Hero Academia chapter. This scene where All For One holds the second user by the neck is very similar to the moment when All For One held Bakugo in the same way. That there might be a connection is quite possible because if we remember, All For One got nervous for some reason when Bakugo awakened his new ability. At that moment, All For One panicked a bit and even remembered the second user of One For All. The fact that he remembered the second user because of Bakugo speaks for the fact that the fight against the second user was not as easy as All For One tries to describe it. He calls his quirk an insect, and yet we clearly see that he cried and years later panics when Bakugo reminds him of the second user. So in that respect there could definitely be a connection. It was revealed that the quirk of the second user of One For All was only able to control small objects. Then we see All For One crush a bullet coming at him from behind without even touching it. It seems to be some kind of telekinesis or invisible barrier. I don't think All For One has ever used such an ability. If you remember him using something similar before, let us know in the comments. From the context, it's quite possible that the bullet was controlled by the second user as it fits the description of his original quirk before it evolved along with the One For All. The bullet is a small object and the fact that it was aimed at All For One speaks to the possibility that it was controlled. All For One seemed quite upset that the second user has such a weak quirk, so the current All For One doesn't understand why Deku can can use it so strongly, and why he can see the second user as well as his little brother Yoichi as vestiges behind Deku. And this is very interesting indeed. So far, All For One with Shigaraki of course, and also Bakugo were the only ones who could ever see a vestige. With Bakugo we don't know if it was a death vision, that is a mere fantasy Bakugo just imagined in his mind in the last seconds of his life, or if he literally faced All Might's vestige for whatever reason. But in the case of All For One and Shigaraki it is quite different. Both One For All and All For One are based more or less on the same concept. What I mean by that is that both of them have some kind of realm in which the users of the quirks can communicate with each other. All For One can communicate with Shigaraki by implanting his own consciousness into Shigaraki, possibly even in the original All For One quirk. So basically it could be that it works the same way as One For All. All For One gave his quirk to Shigaraki, just as Yoichi gave his One For All quirk to the second user. Both vestiges were thus passed on to the next user. Basically you could say that Shigaraki is the second user of All For One, with the difference that All For One can actually interact with Shigaraki's consciousness and even take over his body. Together All For One and One For All can create a common realm where they can see each other. This is not the first time All For One has been able to see the manifestation of the One For All vestiges, so it's not too much of a surprise that he can see them outside of the shared realm. Perhaps this is even a foreshadowing that part of All For One also became part of One For All, because All For One gave Yoichi the essence of the One For All quirk, that is the stockpiling quirk. This quirk is responsible for the quirks uniting and passing on a part of the previous user to the next one. So maybe this idea is really possible and All For One is actually the 10th vestige of One For All. If that's true, maybe that will have a bigger impact on the story later, let's just keep that in mind. And then it is explained again why the second user's quirk has become so strong, even though it was so weak to begin with. It is said that the force created by the One For All quirk is now so strong that it can distort even the foundation of the world. I think this sentence would not make sense if the description referred only to Deku's cells. So we can assume that Deku can basically control everything. But take this with a grain of salt, this is the very first translation we've received. As always, we are waiting for the official release on Sunday to confirm what's really going on. The part about distorting the foundation of the world definitely fits with why the second user of One For All forbid Deku from using this quirk. Because it's too dangerous and it should only be used when there's no other option left. And of course, this devastating effect could also be the reason why the second user warned Deku that he must defeat All For One in the next 5 minutes, or the world is doomed. In the last chapter review, we suspected that it might have something to do with the quirk itself destroying the world, and it looks like our prediction came true. But again, take it with a grain of salt until the official release on Sunday. The fight then continues with back and forth, but it's clear that Deku absolutely has the upper hand. It definitely looks like Izuku Midoriya is officially the strongest quirk user who has ever lived, even if it's only for 5 minutes. This fight is proof of that assumption. After some more back and forth, Deku hits All For One with a punch so powerful that it opens a hole in All For One's chest. Yoichi says that he can see his brother and that what Mirio said is true. This long fight is affecting the fusion between All For One and Shigaraki. All For One starts an inner monologue saying that it's unfair because he hasn't been able to use a single quirk to show how strong his new body is. This is true, considering that all the chaos and problems that All For One caused with Shigaraki's body was only possible with brute force through the next evolution of the quirk Singularity that allowed him to create those body parts. All the power and speed that All For One uses is based on pure physical abilities, and yet the heroes only barely managed to defeat him with Deku's full One For All power. Just imagine what would happen if All For One was actually able to use his quirks or even complete the transformation into the Ultimate Demon Lord. Deku is currently at the peak of the possible power we have seen so far in the entire series, and yet it's barely enough to finish this fight, with that level of power only being maintained for 5 minutes. It's really hard to imagine how much more powerful someone could become to be able to defeat All For One at his full power when the second user's quirk can no longer be used. Then All For One starts screaming and 9 lights, very similar to those of One For All, appear next to him. Deku looks confused and Aizawa wonders if he has another trick up his sleeve. All For One then ends his inner monologue by agreeing with Yoichi and saying that he still has a chance to win if all the effort he has accumulated over the years determines the outcome of this fight. Cut to Spinner, who is huge and drools. End of chapter. Here it is important to know that All For One's monologue did not end before the cut to Spinner, but his monologue ended with the last page of the chapter when we already saw Spinner. At least this is how it is to be understood from the leaks. This could be a hint at what All For One was referring to when he talked about all the efforts he had accumulated over the years that could give him a chance to win. Might have something to do with Spinner. And not just Spinner, but maybe certain other people who are close to All For One, possibly villains from the League of Villains. Of course, we also have to consider that the 9 lights we see next to All For One might also have something to do with his monologue. Maybe each of these lights belong to a person that All For One prepared in case something goes wrong. And that reminds me a lot of what he said about Toya Todoroki. All For One called Toya a seed in case something happened to Shigaraki. And a few chapters ago, we even saw a similar light in Toya's chest. So maybe one of those lights belong to Toya and one to Spinner. That will fit with the idea that 9 lights resemble the 9 vestiges of One For All and are connected to 9 villains that All For One will somehow use to achieve his goal, or get one step further to his final destination. Possibly something could happen with the One For All quirk, or maybe it has something to do with the transformation to the ultimate demon lord. Maybe 9 people, meaning 9 seeds, are sacrificed in some way so that the transformation can be completed. Or maybe All For One gives his 9 chosen seeds, each of them a copy of the All For One quirk. Or maybe he will be able to use those as puppets, just as he currently controls Shigaraki's body, fighting Endeavor at the same time. One of them, or even all of them, could for example possess a spatial teleportation ability due to the copy of All For One, which will then allow all 9 seeds to go to Shigaraki and help him fight Deku. Something along these lines could be quite possible. What do you guys think of this idea? Let us know in the comments. And tell us what you think of the new Boku no Hero Academia chapter. I hope you enjoyed this My Hero Academia chapter review. If you did, please leave a like, and if you want to see more My Hero Academia content, subscribe to our channel with the notification bell activated so you don't miss any of our videos. We make weekly My Hero Academia content, theories and reviews, and of course many other series. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye.